There is a war Britain tried to erase from history. Every night, British soldiers sat in their corporals' club, drinking, and every night they heard screaming. Really disturbing screaming, as if it was associated with someone being hurt, Corporal George Lennox would later recall. His fellow soldiers would laugh. "There's another cunt getting fucking done in," they'd joke. "Yeah, we thumped this wog last night, and he's really screaming." The screams came from Fort Morbot, the place Adenese called the Fingernail Factory. This was Aden, 1963 to 1967, a British colony on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. And what happened there, in interrogation rooms, in detention centers, in the dark corners of Britain's dying empire, was so brutal, so systematic, that the British government spent decades trying to bury it. They succeeded, almost. No memorials mark this war, no minutes of silence. Most Britons today have never heard of it. The Aden emergency killed fewer British soldiers than died in a single month of World War I, just 92 men over 4 years. But that's not why Britain wanted it forgotten. Britain wanted it forgotten because of what British forces did there, because Aden became something terrible, a testing ground, a laboratory. Torture techniques played an important part in counterinsurgency operations in Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus, and the British Cameroons, Brunei, British Guyana, Aden, Borneo/Malaysia, the Persian Gulf, and in Northern Ireland. But in Aden, they perfected them, and then they tried to erase every trace. Files marked secret, documents destroyed, inquiries with deliberately limited scope, a cover-up that lasted 50 years, until the files surfaced. This is the story Britain didn't want you to know, the story of Britain's last colonial war in the Middle East, the story of torture, terror tactics, and a brutal counterinsurgency that foreshadowed Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the war Britain tried to erase from history. Why Britain couldn't let go. Picture a rocky peninsula jutting into the Arabian Sea. No trees, no rivers, just volcanic rock baking under a merciless sun. Average temperature, 35 degrees Celsius. In summer, unbearable. This was Aden, and for 128 years, Britain refused to give it up. Why? Aden was the most strategic port in the world. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Aden became the world's busiest refueling port after New York. Every ship traveling between Europe and Asia stopped there. British warships, merchant vessels, oil tankers, all needed coal, then oil, then supplies. Control Aden, and you controlled the route to India, the jewel in the empire's crown. Britain had seized Aden in 1839 from the Sultan of Lahej. For over a century, it ruled through a combination of direct colonial control in Aden City and indirect rule over the surrounding tribal territories, the Aden Protectorate. The arrangement worked, barely. British administrators governed a small urban population, while local sultans and sheikhs controlled the hinterland. Then came 1952. The winds of change began to sweep across the Arab world, starting in Egypt, accompanied by anti-colonial sentiments. Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the Algerian War of Independence, the Suez Crisis of 1956. Across the Middle East and Africa, colonial subjects were rising up, demanding freedom. Yemen, Aden's neighbor to the north, overthrew its monarchy in a revolution backed by Egypt. Now revolutionary Yemen was right on Britain's doorstep, broadcasting anti-colonial propaganda, training insurgents, sending weapons south. Britain tried to adapt. On 11th February 1959, 6 states signed an accord to form the Federation of the Emirates of South Arabia. The plan was to create a friendly, federated state that would gain independence but remain pro-British. It was fantasy. The federation was unpopular from the start. Tribal leaders appointed by Britain had no legitimacy. The urban population of Aden, educated, politicized, nationalist, wanted nothing to do with feudal sultans. And watching from Yemen, planning in secret, were the insurgents. The grenade that changed everything. December 10, 1963. A grenade was thrown at a gathering of British officials at RAF Cormacsar. Sir Kennedy Travaskis, the British High Commissioner, had just arrived at Cormacsar Airport to catch a flight to London. As he walked across the tarmac, surrounded by British and Arab officials, someone threw a grenade. The explosion killed the High Commissioner's advisor and an Indian woman. 50 others were wounded. The British declared a state of emergency on 10 December 1963. That same day, Britain gave itself unlimited powers. Powers to detain without trial, powers to search and arrest, powers to interrogate. And the insurgents, the National Liberation Front, the NLF, had just declared war. What would follow would make the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya look restrained by comparison.
The enemy they couldn't see. The NLF increased the number of its armed operations from 36 in 1964 to 286 in 1965, 510 in 1966, and 2,900 in 1967. 80 times more attacks in 3 years. Imagine being a British soldier in Aden. You walk down a street in the Crater District, the old Arab quarter. Children play, women shop in the markets, men drink tea in cafes. Anyone could be an insurgent, that child, that shopkeeper, that old man. Grenades come from windows, snipers fire from rooftops, bombs detonate in trash cans, and then the attacker vanishes into the crowd. British forces were targeted by 333 bomb and grenade attacks and 36 shootings. A total of 42 soldiers and 4 civilians were killed over the course of the insurgency. Not many deaths by war standards, but the psychological toll was devastating. Soldiers were terrified, frustrated, angry. They couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see. And when they did catch suspects, they wanted answers. Inside Fort Morbit. Suspects were interrogated at Fort Morbit, where violent beatings and torture through the use of electrodes, the injection of drugs, and disorientation techniques also took place. Fort Morbit Interrogation Center sat on a dusty compound in Aden. From outside, it looked like any military facility. Inside, it was hell. Corporal George Lennox served there in 1964 and 1965. What he witnessed haunted him for the rest of his life. Nearly every night after the state of emergency was declared, and after a lot of suspects were being taken in, we used to hear, sitting in our corporal's club drinking, a lot of screaming and shouting, really disturbing screaming. It was a common thing for us just to laugh and joke about it. Think about that. British soldiers, young men from Glasgow, Manchester, London, drinking and laughing while human beings screamed in agony just meters away. I can remember one particular guy from the regiment who was a boxer for them, and he used to come in and boast in the morning. He used to come in and say, "Yeah, we thumped this wog last night, and he's really screaming." This wasn't one rogue soldier. This was systematic, organized, policy. The 5 techniques.
The methods had names, official designations, the 5 techniques of interrogation: hooding to restrict vision, white noise, stress positions, limited sleep, and a limited diet. Prisoners were forced to stand against walls for hours, sometimes days, supported only by fingertips. Their heads were covered with black hoods. White noise blasted constantly, a sound like static, loud enough to disorient, to break minds. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Sleep was prevented through constant noise and forced standing. And that was just the approved techniques. The files, marked secret, include allegations of beatings, sexual abuse, hoodings, and threats of executions. The worst was an allegation by one prisoner that a soldier had shoved a wooden pole up his anus. The Fort Morbid Interrogation Center was known to the Adinis as the fingernail factory. Why? Because interrogators would slap both sides of a detainee's head simultaneously, bursting eardrums. Medical records frequently noted that detainees had burst eardrums. Because they tortured, systematically, deliberately. And when Corporal Lennox tried to speak out, tried to tell the Sunday Times newspaper what he'd witnessed, he himself was detained, tortured, and expelled from the British Army. By 1966, Britain was losing. By the end of 1966, it was clear Britain had lost military control of Aden. By 1966, the whole of the Arab Special Branch had been assassinated by revolutionaries. Every Arab police officer who worked with the British, dead. Intelligence networks destroyed. The population completely hostile. Faced with the complete hostility of the people, the British could only obtain information through interrogation and torture. And torture wasn't working. Every person tortured created 10 more insurgents. Every family brutalized turned an entire neighborhood against Britain. The very methods Britain used to fight the insurgency were fueling it.
When the world found out. In early 1966, Amnesty International began investigating reports of torture in Aden. Their researchers interviewed former detainees, collected testimonies, documented injuries. Amnesty International published detailed allegations in 1966, forcing the government to launch an inquiry. Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a labor leader who'd campaigned on human rights, faced a political crisis. Torture in British detention camps? Impossible. Britain was civilized. Britain followed the Geneva Conventions. Except Britain didn't. Wilson appointed Roderick Bowen, a prominent lawyer, to investigate. But there was a problem. Although Bowen was not allowed to investigate the substance of the claims, he delivered a damning report in which he ordered the closure of the Army Interrogation Center and the replacement of soldier interrogators with civilians. Read that again. Bowen wasn't allowed to investigate the substance of the claims. He couldn't question the torture allegations themselves, only examine procedures. It was a whitewash from the start. But even with those restrictions, Bowen's findings were devastating. He made clear that he believed 3 soldiers, an officer and 2 non-commissioned officers, were at the center of the torture claims. In the files, these men were identified only as Omar the Maltese, the Algerian, and a man called Shepherd. Fake names. In fact, they were British soldiers who had tried to disguise their identities when carrying out the torture on the detainees. British soldiers pretending to be Arabs while torturing Arab prisoners. Justice denied. The files show that despite a strong case for bringing court-martial proceedings, including damaging testimony by 16 guards, the Army decided to quietly drop the cases on the grounds that the incidents had taken place too long ago. 18 months. 18 months too long ago to prosecute torture.
In fact, the officer at the center of the scandal had been dismissed from the Army in 1966 after he was found to have been bouncing checks, not for torture, for writing bad checks. The government tried to bury it. Foreign Secretary George Brown actually defended the torture in his introduction to the Bowen Report. He wrote that Fort Morbut had operated with considerable success, having provided information leading to the discovery of numerous arms caches and to the arrest of a number of terrorists. Translation: torture works, so it's justified. The humiliating retreat. In February 1966, the government announced that they would be abandoning the Aden base. Britain was leaving, giving up. After 128 years, the strategic port was no longer worth the cost, financial or moral. But Britain couldn't just leave immediately. The withdrawal would take 21 months. 21 months of continued fighting, continued casualties, continued torture. Life for most Arabs in Aden became one of constant street searches and house raids, frequently accompanied by cowardly acts of bullying or vicious beatings from the British soldiers. One British battalion alone, in a period of 6 months, searched 35,000 Arabs and 8,000 vehicles, in the course of which they captured only 12 grenades and 6 pistols. Think about those numbers. 35,000 people searched, 8,000 vehicles stopped to find 12 grenades and 6 pistols. Collective punishment on an industrial scale. In the 11 months of 1967, when the British were still in Aden, British forces killed 119 Arabs and wounded 123. For what? A war already lost, a withdrawal already announced. The humiliating final humiliation. On June 20, 1967, Arab soldiers in the South Arabian Army, soldiers Britain had trained, equipped, and armed, mutinied. They turned their weapons on their British officers. 22 British soldiers died that day. 31 were wounded. The Crater district fell completely under insurgent control. British forces retreated to their bases, besieged in their own colony. In July, Colonel Colin "Mad" Mitchell led the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in a dramatic reoccupation of Crater. The British press celebrated it as a victory, proof Britain still had fight left. It was theater. By that point, independence was 3 months away. On November 30, 1967, at midnight, the Union Jack came down. On 30 November 1967, the Federation of South Arabia ceased to exist when the People's Republic of Southern Yemen was proclaimed. British forces withdrew in defeat, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and 128 years of colonial rule. It was the last time Britain lost a colony through military force. And then came the cover-up.
Operation Erase. As British forces prepared to leave Aden, officials faced a problem: the files. Thousands of documents detailing interrogations, torture allegations, civilian casualties, evidence that could destroy Britain's reputation. They couldn't leave them for the incoming government, so they destroyed them. Some files have been released, but more are sealed until 2050. Until 2050. Documents from the 1960s locked away until everyone involved is dead. But Aden was just one piece of a much larger operation. Across the dying British Empire, from Kenya to Malaya, from Cyprus to British Guyana, colonial administrators received secret instructions, a program with a bureaucratic name: Operation Legacy. The orders were specific. Precise instructions were given for methods to be used for destruction, including burning and dumping at sea. Burn them,
shred them, weigh them down, and dump them in the ocean, whatever it took to hide the truth. Files marked Watch, the most sensitive documents, could only be viewed by a British subject of European descent. Even at empire's end, racial hierarchy determined who could know the truth. The conspiracy of silence. For decades, Britain maintained the lie. When historians asked for documents, they were told lost, destroyed during the transition to independence. No records exist. Torture techniques played an important part in British counterinsurgency operations from Palestine to Northern Ireland, but the evidence? Gone. Aden became a forgotten war. Ask most Britons today, they've never heard of it. It doesn't appear in school curricula. There are no monuments. The Ma'ala British Military Cemetery in Aden holds neat rows of headstones for British soldiers, but there is not a scrap of vegetation, just rows of neat headstones. And the Adenese have little nostalgia for British rule. Local ministers regard British aid as reparation. The very people Britain claimed to be civilizing wanted nothing to do with their former masters. But the truth can't be burned forever. In 2011, elderly Kenyans sued the British government for compensation, claiming torture during the Mau Mau emergency. The government's defense? No evidence exists. The files were destroyed. Lawyers didn't believe them. They dug deeper and discovered Hanslope Park, a secretive government facility in Buckinghamshire, a secure vault, and inside, 8,800 colonial files that Britain swore didn't exist. Files from 37 former colonies, including Aden. The files show how the army was forced to investigate dozens of allegations of torture made by Arabs who had been arrested at the height of the insurgency. The files proved everything: the torture, the cover-up, the deliberate destruction of evidence. The new documents show that the lessons from the military interrogation of detainees in Aden were ignored in later conflicts involving British troops, particularly after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. History repeating. In 2003, British forces invaded Iraq. In 2004, at a detention facility in Basra, an Iraqi hotel receptionist named Baha Musa died in British custody. A public inquiry found that British soldiers had subjected detainees to serious, gratuitous violence. Army training manuals failed to explain that the 5 interrogation techniques had been banned by the British since 1972 and were also illegal under the Geneva Convention. The same techniques used in Aden 40 years earlier: hooding, stress positions, white noise, sleep deprivation. Britain had learned nothing. Or rather, Britain had learned to hide it better.
The pattern across empire. Aden wasn't unique. It was a link in a chain of brutality that stretched across the dying British Empire. Similar abuses occurred during the national liberation struggles in Malaya, Aden, Cyprus, and the north of Ireland. Malaya, 1948 to 1960. At least 34,000 opponents of British rule were detained without trial. Tens of thousands of villagers were forcibly uprooted from their land at gunpoint. Troops burned their homes and crops and deported them to barbed wire encampments, euphemistically known as new villages. Cyprus, 1954 to 1958. Torture techniques were widely used against nationalists by the British Army. These included beating suspects on the stomach with a flat board, twisting the testicles, suffocation with a wet cloth, and burning with cigarettes. Kenya, 1952 to 1960. Concentration camps, systematic torture, 90,000 executed, tortured, or maimed. Northern Ireland, 1971. The 5 techniques used again.
A European human rights court found they amounted to inhuman and degrading treatment, causing intense physical and mental suffering. And Aden? The use of torture in Aden was systematic at the Fort Morbat Interrogation Center and at Al-Mansoura prison. Detainees were beaten, interrogated naked, refused toilet visits, and deprived of food and sleep. The same methods, the same denials, the same cover-ups. Why Aden matters? Because Aden was where Britain tested the limits. During the most bitter years of the Aden emergency, the British Terrorist Weapons and Tactics Team specialized in what one retired operative recalls as using terrorist weapons and tactics against terrorists. Terror against terror. Torture for intelligence. Collective punishment to break resistance. These weren't aberrations, they were policy. Laithwaite complains to his superior that torture is the recruiting sergeant of the terrorist. Even British officers knew torture doesn't work. It creates more enemies than it defeats. Every person tortured radicalizes their family, their friends, their community. But Britain kept doing it. Aden, Iraq, Afghanistan. The cost. 92 British soldiers died in Aden over 4 years. That's tragic. Every life lost is a tragedy. But how many Adenese died? How many were tortured? How many families were destroyed? We don't know. Britain made sure we wouldn't know. In the 11 months of 1967, British forces killed 119 Arabs and wounded 123. That's just 1 year, just deaths in combat. It doesn't count those who died from torture, from beatings, from abuse in detention. It doesn't count the psychological scars that last lifetimes.
What Britain learned. After Aden, Britain learned an important lesson. Not to stop torturing, but to hide it better. Destroy the evidence, seal the files, wait until the victims are dead. Some files have been released, but more are sealed until 2050. 2050, that's 83 years after Aden's independence. Everyone who served there will be dead. Everyone who was tortured will be dead. The victims, the perpetrators, the witnesses. Only then will Britain allow the full truth to emerge. The compensation fight. The UK government's expression of regret and its agreement to pay compensation to Kenyan torture victims must now lead to similar redress for the victims of repression in other colonial-era domains, Malaya, Aden, Cyprus, and the north of Ireland. Some have called for compensation for Aden's victims. Britain has refused. Unlike Kenya, where elderly survivors sued and won, no organized legal challenge has emerged from Aden. Most victims are dead, the rest scattered across Yemen, a country torn by civil war. Who will speak for them now? The uncomfortable truth. Britain wants to remember its empire as civilizing, railways, schools, democracy, the rule of law. But Fort Morbat existed, the screaming happened, the torture was real, and Britain tried to erase it from history. Perhaps you British would prefer to go and drink some tea rather than listen to the truth, Yemen's President Ali Abdullah Saleh told a British delegation. What you are doing in Iraq is unacceptable. He gave them a gift, a specially minted coin. It depicts the flag of Yemen being raised over the old British governor's palace in Aden, a reminder of what Britain lost and how. Why this matters. The Aden emergency lasted 4 years. Britain lost. The colony gained independence. That's history. But the cover-up lasted 60 years. The torture techniques Britain perfected in Aden appeared again in Northern Ireland in 1971, in Iraq in 2003, in Afghanistan. The files burned, the evidence destroyed, the victims silenced. That's not history, that's policy.
When a democracy systematically destroys evidence of state torture, when it seals documents for 80 years, when it prosecutes whistleblowers who expose abuse, that democracy has something to hide. And what Britain was hiding in Aden was this: the methods of torture, the deliberate brutality, the systematic cover-up. The same pattern repeated across the empire: Kenya, Cyprus, Malaya, Northern Ireland. Each time Britain claimed surprise, isolated incidents, a few bad apples. Each time the files told a different story: systematic, approved at the highest levels, policy. The final question: how many more Fort Morbits exist in Britain's classified archives? How many more concentration camps, torture centers, massacres have been erased from history? What else is sealed until 2050? The war lasted 8 years, from 1963 to 1967, plus the aftermath. The silence lasted 60 years, and counting. Britain tried to erase this war from history. For a long time they succeeded. School textbooks don't mention it. Memorials don't commemorate it. Most Britons have never heard of it. But the truth survives, in secret files, in survivors' memories, in the scars that never healed. The war Britain tried to erase from history can't be erased anymore. The files surfaced, the truth emerged, and now you know.